A star in the night, the birth of Jesus and the visit of the Magi. Picture a cold night in Bethlehem over 2,000 years ago. Streets are crowded, the inns packed to the brim. Emperor Augustus has ordered a census. Everyone must return to their hometown. Among the throng, a weary couple desperately seeks a place to rest. The woman, Mary, is about to give birth. Her husband, Joseph, knocks on every door, but in vain. No one has room for them. It's in this context of chaos and indifference that the most extraordinary event in history is about to unfold. Birth, Son of God. Finally, Joseph and Mary find refuge in a stable. Imagine the scene. The smell of hay mingled with that of animals, straw crunching under their feet, faint glow of an oil lamp. It's here, in these humble and precarious conditions, that Jesus comes into the world. Matthew doesn't dwell on the details of the birth. He simply tells us, she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. What simplicity in describing the incarnation of the Son of God. Think for a moment about this paradox. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, is born in poverty and anonymity. The one who created the universe becomes a vulnerable baby, entirely dependent on the care of his earthly parent. What a powerful message about God's humility and love. This humble birth reminds us that God often reveals himself where we least expect. In our world that values power, wealth, and celebrity, Christmas story invites us to seek God in simplicity and humility. Although Matthew doesn't mention the shepherds in his account, it's Luke who tells us about their visit. It's important to include them in our story, for they represent a crucial aspect of the Christmas message. Imagine these rough men, spending the night in the fields, watching over their flock. Suddenly the sky lights up, and an angel appears to them, announcing the birth of the Savior. Terrified at first, they are soon filled with joy and rush to Bethlehem to see the child. Why does God choose to reveal the birth of his Son first to shepherds? In the society of that time, shepherds were considered outcasts, unreliable and unclean by religious standards, and yet they are the first to receive the good news. Isn't this a powerful reminder that the gospel message is for everyone, especially for those whom society rejects or despises? This part of the story challenges us today. In our world divided by prejudice and discrimination, Christmas message reminds us that God shows no favoritism. He invites everyone, regardless of their social status, origin, or past, to come to the manger to meet the Savior. The story doesn't end there. Matthew tells us about an extraordinary event that occurs sometime after Jesus' birth. Wise men from the east arrive in Jerusalem, guided by a mysterious star. Who were these wise men? Contrary to popular image, they were probably not kings. The Greek term magoi rather refers to scholars, astrologers, or pagan priests, likely from Persia or Babylon. Imagine these men, dressed in exotic robes, mounted on their camels, crossing hundreds of miles of desert, guided only by a star and an ancient prophecy. Their journey speaks to humanity's spiritual quest. These men represent all those who, throughout history, sought truth beyond their own culture and tradition. Their story reminds us that God reveals himself to those who sincerely seek him, regardless of their background. But what was this star? Scientists and theologians have proposed various explanations: a comet, a planetary conjunction, or a supernatural phenomenon. Whatever its exact nature, this star reminds us that God can use both the natural and the supernatural to guide people to him. Their arrival in Jerusalem causes a great stir. They ask, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." This innocent question will trigger a series of events with dramatic consequences. News of the wise men's arrival quickly reaches King Herod's ears. Matthew tells us that he was disturbed and all Jerusalem with him. Why such a reaction? To understand, we need to know about Herod. He was a cruel and paranoid man, known for having murdered several members of his own family out of fear of losing his throne. The idea that a new king of the Jews had been born represented a mortal threat to him. Herod illustrates how power can corrupt and blind. His reaction to Jesus' birth shows us how selfishness and fear can prevent us from recognizing and welcoming the truth, even when it's right in front of us. Herod calls together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law. He asks them where the Messiah is to be born, They answer without hesitation, "In Bethlehem in Judea. For this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Notice the tragic irony here. The religious leaders know the scriptures perfectly. They can quote the exact prophecy about the Messiah's birthplace, and yet they make no effort to go and see for themselves if this prophecy has been fulfilled. Knowledge without faith is sterile. This scene challenges us. It's not enough to know the truth. We must act on it. In our world saturated with information, we sometimes risk falling into the same trap as these religious leaders, having a lot of knowledge about God without truly seeking Him. Herod, cunning and manipulative, secretly calls the wise men. He questions them about the exact time the star appeared, then sends them to Bethlehem with these instructions. "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." Of course, Herod's intention is not to worship the child, but to eliminate him. This is the beginning of a cosmic confrontation between God's kingdom and the kingdoms of this world, a theme that will repeat throughout Matthew's Gospel. This opposition to God's plan is not unique to Herod. Throughout history, and even today, the gospel message often encounters resistance. Sometimes this opposition is open and violent. Other times it's more subtle, manifesting as indifference or passive rejection. The wise men resume their journey to Bethlehem, again guided by the star. Matthew tells us they were overjoyed when they saw the star stop over the place where the child was. Imagine the scene. These learned men, these foreign dignitaries, entering a humble home in Bethlehem. They see the child with Mary, his mother, and what do? They bow down and worship him. Then they open their treasures and present him with gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These gifts are not chosen randomly. Gold is a gift fit for a king. Frankincense is used in divine worship, suggesting Jesus' divinity. Myrrh, a perfume used for embalming, foreshadows Jesus' sacrificial death. Without realizing it, the wise men proclaim through their gifts the identity and mission of this child: King, God, and Savior. The wise men's reaction offers us a model of response to God's revelation. They don't just intellectually acknowledge the truth, they worship it and offer it their most precious possessions. Their example invites us to ask ourselves, what is our response to Jesus? Are we ready to worship Him and offer Him the best of ourselves? After their visit, the wise men are warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. So they return to their country by another route. This seemingly trivial detail is full of meaning. The encounter with Jesus changes our trajectory. We cannot meet the King of Kings and continue on the same path. This part of the story reminds us that authentic faith transforms our lives. It changes our priorities, our values, our way of seeing the world. Like the wise men, a true encounter with Jesus should lead us to take a different route in life. Shortly after the wise men's departure, Joseph receives a divine warning of his own. An angel appears to him in a dream and says, "Get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." Without hesitation, Joseph obeys. Gets up during the night, takes the child and his mother, and leaves for Egypt. Imagine this perilous journey. A young family fleeing in the night, carrying a baby, crossing the desert to escape the wrath of a murderous king. Matthew sees in this event the fulfillment of another prophecy. "Out of Egypt I called my son." He thus establishes a parallel between Jesus and Israel's history. Just as God brought His people out of Egypt, He will now bring His Son out of Egypt to fulfill His mission of salvation. This flight to Egypt reminds us that the path of faith is not always easy or safe. Sometimes following God means facing dangers, uncertainty, even exile. The story also assures us that God is with us in these difficult times, guiding and protecting those who trust Him. Meanwhile, in Bethlehem, a tragedy is unfolding. Herod, furious at being outwitted by the wise men, orders the massacre of all boys 2 years old and under in Bethlehem and its vicinity. It's an act of unimaginable cruelty, but unfortunately consistent with what we know of Herod's character. Matthew again quotes a prophecy, this time from Jeremiah. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." This dark episode reminds us that Jesus coming into the world was not without opposition. From his birth, the forces of evil seek to eliminate him. And yet, despite the violence and tragedy, God's plan is fulfilled. The massacre of the innocents raises difficult questions about suffering and evil in the world. How can a God of love allow such tragedy? There's no simple answer to this question, but the story shows us that God is not indifferent to our suffering. In Jesus, he entered our broken world to confront evil and death from within. After Herod's death, an angel again appears to Joseph in a dream, telling him it's now safe to return to Israel. Joseph obeys, but hearing that Archelaus, Herod's son, is reigning over Judea, he's afraid to settle there. Warned once more in a dream, he withdraws to Galilee, to the town of Nazareth. Matthew sees in this event the fulfillment of another prophecy. He will be called a Nazarene. Although no specific prophecy mentions Nazareth, this term could refer to the idea that the Messiah would be despised and rejected, Nazareth being a poorly regarded town at the time. This return to Nazareth reminds us that God often works through the ordinary and unexpected. Jesus, the Savior of the world, grew up in an insignificant little town. This encourages us to see value and potential in places and people the world might consider unimportant. What can we draw from this extraordinary story for our lives today? First, Jesus' birth reminds us that God often acts in unexpected ways. Who would have thought that the Savior of the world would be born in a stable? This invites us to be attentive to God's work in the most unlikely places in our lives and our world. Perhaps God is doing something great in aspects of your life that you consider insignificant or ordinary. Second, the reaction of the different characters in the story challenges us. The shepherds and the wise men, considered outcasts or foreigners, are the first to recognize and worship Jesus. This pushes us to ask ourselves, are we ready to recognize God at work even when it defies our expectations? Are we open to the idea that God might reveal himself through people we would tend to ignore or reject? Third, Herod's opposition reminds us that the gospel message is radical and disturbing to the powers of this world. Following Jesus often means going against the current of our culture. Are we ready to take this risk? In what areas of our life are we tempted to compromise our faith, conform to society's expectation? Fourth, Joseph's obedience to divine warnings is a powerful example of faith in action. How often are we called to obey God, even when his call seems difficult or unreasonable? Joseph's faith encourages us to trust God even when we don't fully understand his plan. Fifth, the wise men's journey reminds us that spiritual seeking is a fundamental element of human experience. Like them, many people today are searching for meaning and truth. How can we as believers be like the star that guides seekers to Jesus? Sixth, the wise men's gifts invite us to reflect on what we offer to Jesus. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh were precious and symbolic gifts. What precious gifts from our lives can we offer to Jesus? How can we honor him with our talents, our time, our resources? Finally, the theme of fulfilled prophecies that runs through this entire account reminds us that God is faithful to his promises. Even when circumstances seem to oppose it, God's plan is fulfilled. This can encourage us in our own moments of doubt or difficulty. If God has been faithful in the past, we can trust him for the future. The story of Jesus' birth has profoundly marked our culture. Think of the art, music, and literature inspired by this account. Painters like Rembrandt and Botticelli have immortalized the nativity scene. Composers like Handel have created masterpieces like The Messiah. Writers from Charles Dickens to C.S. Lewis have explored Christmas themes in their works. Even in our increasingly secular world, the Christmas story continues to fascinate and inspire. Why? Perhaps because it touches on deeply human themes: hope in darkness, the dignity of the humble, possibility of redemption. But beyond its cultural impact, the Christmas story invites us to a personal encounter with the God who became man. It challenges us to see beyond traditions and decorations, to grasp the transformative reality of the Incarnation. At the heart of the Christmas story lies the mystery of the Incarnation, God becoming man in Jesus Christ. It's a concept that has fascinated theologians and thinkers through the centuries. How can the infinite become finite? How can the Creator become a creature? The Incarnation tells us something profound about the nature of God and his relationship with us. shows us a God who doesn't remain distant, but who enters into the human condition with all its joys and sorrows. In Jesus, God experienced hunger, fatigue, temptation, suffering, everything we experience. This truth has profound implications for our spiritual life. It means that God intimately understands our struggles and sufferings. It also means that our humanity, with all its limits and weaknesses, is not an obstacle to encountering God, but the very place where this encounter can occur. The story of Jesus' birth and the visit of the wise men is not just a beautiful Christmas tale. The beginning of a cosmic revolution, the entry of God Himself into our broken world to redeem and restore it. This story invites us to ask crucial questions. Who is Jesus to us? Are we ready, like the shepherds and the wise men, to seek Him and worship Him? Are we willing, like Joseph, to obey God even when it disrupts our plans? The story didn't end in Bethlehem. It continues today, in our lives and in our world. Every time someone recognizes Jesus as Savior, every time an act of love is done in His name, every time an injustice is fought for His glory, Christmas story continues. As we conclude this video, I invite you to reflect. How does this ancient story resonate in your life today? What is your response to this child born in a manger, who is also the King of Kings? How can you, in your daily life, continue the story that began in Bethlehem? In our next video, we'll explore the beginning of Jesus' ministry, His baptism and temptation in the wilderness. We'll see how the baby in the manger becomes the man who will change the course of history. Prepare to discover a Jesus who challenges our expectations and calls us to a transformed life. May the grace and peace of Emmanuel, God with us, be with you until our next meeting.